What I'd like to do now is turn your attention to an organization almost nobody's ever heard of, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, that up until recently was called the Organization of Islamic Conference. Why? Because among the entities out there that I have talked about, very few seem to have been so large and yet at the same time so unknown to the viewing public. Now, I've gone to very, very rarefied briefings by many members of the senior military and national security in the national security space, and I will ask, who here has ever heard of the OIC? And you might get out of 100 senior military officers or people, civilians in equal status, some answer like, well, that would be the officer in charge. You just kind of say, wow, what's that all about? The total lack of understanding of who these people are, I tell you, it's like not knowing what the Warsaw Pact was in the Soviet Union. It's just incredible to me. So if I know that a room full of people who are national security planners in the war on terror are unfamiliar with the OIC, I actually know they know nothing about what's going on. Because I will say, this is the very public, invisible entity. So let's just take a look at it. And I'll ask you if you would agree that if I could prove that this entity is real and we don't know about it, doesn't it mean we're basically fighting a war almost blind? Let's take a look. So what we'll do is we'll go to their webpage, the Organization of Islamic Conference, now the Cooperation. And what does it say? It says about the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Conference is the second largest intergovernmental organization after the United Nations, which has a membership of 57 states, actually 56 and the Palestinian Authority. They just redid their charter back in 2008. The organization is the collective voice of the Muslim world. Well, think about this, please. If this entity is able to represent all 57 member states, they may well be able to make that claim. But if not, well, we'll see. And of course, they redid their charter. So who is this OIC? Well, when they meet as a summit, an Islamic summit, they are composed of kings and heads of states and governments and of the member states. So, think about that. If the OIC is what it purports to be, and they meet at a summit level, they would actually represent the entire Muslim world, wouldn't they? This would be true. And we don't know it exists. Think about it. What would happen if they passed treaties as the OIC that we didn't know about? Would it be possible for there to be two foreign policies running parallel? One for you and one that kind of is operative inside the Islamic world, where one side is aware of both and one side is barely aware of one. So, let's take a look. They meet every year at the foreign ministers meet once a year. Who do we represent when they meet when the OIC meets? Well, they put Ummah in the mission scope. It's very important because Ummah is one of the words the Department of Homeland Security says we're not supposed to use because it has a religious connotation. But here, the OIC says that when the heads of states of the Muslim world meet, in Chapter 5, the Islamic Summit, when they say they meet, they deliberate issues of concern to member states and the Ummah. When they have extraordinary sessions, it will be held whenever the interests of the Ummah warrant. So, the Ummah, the Muslim nation, the Muslim community, well, I guess I would have to say that if this is true, and of course it is, that if the summit meets and all the heads of states are there, they would be the Ummah. So, the Council of Foreign Ministers will deal with specific issues of concern to the Ummah. So, what else do we have? Well, the Secretary General of the OIC, a man named Eklemadin Isanoglu, he's been quoted more than once suggesting, but here's one we have here, that the OIC fulfills the function of a caliphate and embodies the Islamic solidarity that it once held. I will argue that the OIC is the proto-caliphate, and that the OIC, if it's on its current trajectory, will become the caliphate. So, what's very important to realize is when you take a look at the OIC charter, it says that one of the things its mission is to do is to assist Muslim minorities and communities outside the member states. In fact, Chapter 1, Article 1 goes on to say, to safeguard the rights, dignity, and religious and cultural identity of Muslim communities and minorities in non-Muslim states. The United States would be a non-Muslim state. Does this mean that the OIC is claiming jurisdiction over Muslims inside the United States? Because to read that, that's certainly in the zone. So, let's take a look at this. How many of you have ever heard of the Cairo Declaration on Human Rights in Islam? It was promulgated by the OIC in 1990, and here it is coming from their official webpage. And it's very important to know that the OIC has designated English as an official language, so that when the OIC publishes their information on a English language website, it's official in that language. But just as importantly, in 1993, the OIC submitted the Cairo Declaration on Human Rights in Islam to the United Nations. So, we have been on legal notice, the entire world, that the Cairo Declaration on Human Rights in Islam is what guides human rights in the Islamic world. We're not going to go through the entire Cairo Declaration. We'll just go through the last two articles. And we'll note that we will have an article of inclusion. When we say this, we mean X, followed by an article of exclusion. And when we say X, we don't mean that. Let's take a look. Article 24 of the Cairo Declaration on Human Rights in Islam says, all the rights and freedoms stipulated in this declaration are subject to the Islamic Sharia. So when we say human rights, we mean Sharia. And what does Article 25 say? Article 25 says, the Islamic Sharia is the only source of reference for the explanation or clarification of any of the articles of this declaration. So, and when we say human rights, we mean nothing else but. Now this has huge consequences. If the OIC, which is represented by the Muslim world at the head of state level, promulgates this Cairo Declaration on behalf of all its member states, what it means is they have told every country in the world officially that when they say human rights, they mean Sharia law and they mean nothing else. Now, think about this. If we know that most of our senior analysts know nothing about the OIC, they will have no substantive understanding about the Cairo Declaration on Human Rights in Islam. And yet this is a game changer. This should be changing how we understand what is communicated to us. For example, if the head of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt says they support human rights, or if CARE says that they are the Muslim civil rights entity in America, we should know that by definition, by their treaty, they mean that they are there to implement Sharia. But they define human rights as Sharia. So, it's important. So, this gives rise to a rule. We'll call it a rule of interpretation. Any analysis undertaken on subject matter where the OIC, an OIC member state, or initiatives reasonably arising out of either speaks of rights and freedoms or associated defined terms that arise out of the Cairo Declaration on Human Rights in Islam, those rights and freedoms can only be assessed in terms of what Islamic law permits them to mean, where Islamic law is the only criteria by which a determination can be made in the event of any dispute requiring resolution. And the standard is strict. Why? Because they said the standard was strict. When we say human rights, we mean Sharia law, and we mean nothing else. So, you take all those political science analysis of what they could possibly mean using an anthropological or a psychosocial model, and you take them and you know what can them. Because that, next to what they said is how they define their rules, is just completely irrelevant. Okay? It might drive a whole lot of master's and PhD theses. It has no bearing on what we're talking about. So, now, remember that in the intelligence world, one of the two most important products you're actually asked to generate. I like it at the basic level. The most likely course of action, the most dangerous course of action. Okay? If you oppose this rule that you define their terms the way they define them and then said so in a treaty, if you use their definitions for the terms they use, by imposing that rule, you'll retain the ability to generate the most likely and most dangerous course of action. What's the most likely course of action? They passed this and they meant it. What's the most dangerous course of action? That the OIC passed the Cairo Declaration of Human Rights in Islam, that they meant it and you don't know. So, That's what you have to think about when you hear them say they're there to promote human rights. So let's take a look at an example here. Could a Muslim student unreasonably see this story coming up as an example of human rights violation? Remember, if human rights is defined as Sharia law, then we have to see what Sharia law would say. This is a story about from Fox News on Catholic universities having crosses in their classrooms as a human rights violation. In fact, violates the human rights of Muslims. How could that? That's kind of silly. So we take a look at some of the stories here about what's going on, but we'll just take a look. So we take a look at Ibn Kathir and his treatment of verse 929. And speaking of the Pact of Umar, the submitted Christians will refrain from raising their voices. Well, I have to find it here. We will not sound the bells in our churches except discreetly raise our voices while reciting our holy books inside our churches in the presence of Muslims. Oh, we will refrain from erecting crosses on the outside of our church. It says, we will refrain from erecting crosses on the outside of our churches. Then we see from the first book on Islamic law of warfare written by Shaybani, a man who died in the year 804, so this is not exactly new. Dhimmis should be allowed to build neither new synagogues nor churches, but only to repair those already in existence when they became dhimmis. So, now we take a look at the Reliance of the Traveler, published in 1994 in Beltsville, Maryland. So this applies to America. Such non-Muslim subjects are obliged to comply with Islamic rules. They are forbidden to openly display crosses. So, if they're openly forbidden to display crosses, would the display of crosses in the Catholic Church violate human rights under Islamic law? That's the question to ask. Because here you have an article that came out last October 2011 from Al Rama channel, an Egyptian satellite program. And what did it say? Copts are infidels as stated by the Quran. Will we apologize for the Quran to please them? Allah's curse be on them. The Christians incited the feud, tension, and Muslims didn't burn the church. Of course, we know that they did. Okay? Copts are infidels toward Allah, glory be unto him, as found in the Holy Quran. Allah's curse upon them. Do we apologize to the Quran and pervert what is found in it so we can please them? Never. So we kind of know what the answer is going to be here. That if there are crosses in the classroom, then it's a violation of Sharia law. So let's take a couple other examples from the OIC. Some things to keep in mind, because remember, if the OIC is saying things, it seems to reflect official status. So let's take a few other examples from the OIC, just so we can take a look. Okay, this is from a conference of Report to the Secretary General from Mali in 2001, Contemporary Forms of Racism. What I'd like to point out is a lot of people read language in UN documents that come from paragraph 4, but they're almost never exposed to paragraph 3. So what does the OIC say about racism? Well, paragraph 3, under a section called Contemporary Forms of Racism, they say contemporary forms of racism are based on discrimination, disparagement on a cultural rather than biological basis. In this context, I think it's supposed to say, the increasing trend of Islamophobia, as distinct from xenophobia, in non-Muslim societies is very alarming. Okay, so here you have in paragraph 3 that when the OIC says contemporary forms of racism, and by extension racism, really, that they mean something that is not even biological. Well, that's a total redefinition of the term racism. So you need to understand that. And that would be a definition that has no application to any U.S. code definition of racism whenever they're using this definition. And that means there's some discipline in understanding that there's been a replacement of a term's definition. Because paragraph 4 goes on and says, the Committee for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination and the Commission on Human Rights at the United Nations, along with subsidiary bodies and mechanisms, have an important guiding role in the elimination of contemporary forms of racism, which is not racism, All governments should cooperate fully with the Committee on and the Special Rapporteur on contemporary forms of racism, which is not racism, okay, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance, with the view to enabling them to fulfill their mandates and to examine the incidence of contemporary forms of racism, which is not racism. More specifically, discrimination based on religion, including against Islam and Muslims. That's very interesting. I just put a brief together for a group of people to show that when the Islamic world says religion, they only mean Islam. Okay? And that's true as a doctrinal matter. It may be also a matter for a recording down the line where we'll make that and just drive that point down hard, solid, because there's no possibility of it being anything else. Why do I say that? Because you can't open the door that Islamic law has sealed shut. So, I guess when the Islamic world says racism, they mean defamation of Islam or Islamophobia. Now, it's very interesting because people have taken note of how the term xenophobia is used in a lot of OIC documents. And it seems to mean that any person who would stand up for their way of life or their beliefs, I am Steve Coughlin, I'm an American citizen, I want to defend the Constitution, that would make me xenophobic. Think about that. Think about how it's being used and watch. You think I'm overstating it? So anybody who would engage in going after somebody for being xenophobic in U.S. government as used by the OIC would actually be attacking an American for wanting to stand up for American principles. Now, this is one of those things that you have to spend some time watching it. But after a while, it becomes pretty obvious. So, it seems that there's an awful lot of extraterritorial claims. Now, as we take a look at this slide right here, I want to point something out that is obvious, except the obvious needs to be pointed out. Remember, almost none of our national security analysts have ever heard of the OIC. Yet here is a slide coming from the United Nations, and it says the Permanent Observer Mission to the United Nations, New York, the UN, and the OIC. That the OIC is so official in its status, it has permanent observer status at the UN. Why observer status? Well, because they're represented by 57 countries, 56 countries and the Palestinian Authority. But having permanent observer status means that they're allowed to play a semi-official role there. Well, let's just take a look. They have a ambassador there, Ufuk Gosen. So there you have it. I just think it's important that people understand that presence is there. So here we have it. Here is another OIC document. And remember, for people who've never heard of the OIC, they would have no understanding that in 1999, the OIC passed the OIC Convention on Combating International Terrorism. And we don't even know it exists. And here is a formally served a convention. And I pulled this off the UN webpage as opposed to the OIC's. And really, you could read the whole thing. But what I like to point out is all you really have to do is read the first two articles, because that's all you need to know. In fact, until you know what the first two articles mean, there's no point to reading the rest of the convention. It says, pursuant to the tenets of tolerant Islamic Sharia, which reject all forms of violence and terrorism, and in particular, especially those based on extremism and a call for protection of human rights being defined as Sharia law. Okay, the next article, abiding by the lofty moral and religious principles, particularly provisions of Islamic Sharia. So the first two articles of the OIC Convention on Combating International Terrorism say, boom, boom, this convention is based on Sharia law. So until you know what Sharia law says about terrorism, you know nothing. You don't know what the rest of this says. And you know what? They know that 98% of you don't even know the OIC exists, so you wouldn't even know that the convention is there. And of the 2% who does, 98% of you will never stop and say, what does Sharia law say? And of those that do, someone who says you can't do that because it's a violation of the First Amendment will shut down most of you. So they're risking that the 1% of the people who actually decide to do the professional due diligence and understand that the OIC exists, they're governed specifically and solely by Sharia law, and then analyze that convention that way, and that because it's a legally served document, that it means just one thing, they're taking the risk that that 1% will be overwhelmed by a huge information campaign to tell you that these aren't the droids you're looking for. So, here's a good example. The UN officially is on record as defining terrorism exclusively in Islamic legal terms. But I like to do the situation replacement thing. Because if this statement here, where it says, believing that terrorism constitutes a gross violation of human rights, if we're correct, we should be able to take this generic language and put in what they really mean, and it would still make sense. Let's take a look. Believing that the killing of a Muslim without right constitutes a gross violation of Sharia law. Didn't Major Hassan say that that was the reason why he was going to become a jihadi? Because he would be killing a Muslim without right? He did. Killing without right, meaning the killing of a Muslim without right, is really the definition, the Islamic definition of terrorism. So, let's see. What I point out here, it just needs to be pointed out. This is a legally served legal instrument that has put us on legal notice since 1999 that when the Islamic world says terrorism, they only mean terrorism according to Islamic law, and they mean nothing else. So when an Islamic entity says they condemn terrorism in all of its forms, if you take a look at how they write it, and you take a stack of the things where they say that, you'll realize that in there is the we condemn terrorism in all its forms, all the forms condemned by Sharia. And we have a treaty here to say it. So, to cooperate in combating terrorism in all its forms and manifestations. But I'd like you to think about this. Terrorism analysis that we do in the war on terror with regard to the Islamic world that does not account for Islamic legal characterizations of terrorism may be negligent as a matter of law. Because remember, we are on notice, formal legal notice, that that's what they're saying. So we are formally not allowed not to know this. So, say you can't get yourself to be convinced that Sharia law is the law of the land, despite the fact that the countries that we're up against say so, and most of them have it in their constitutions. Which means, by the way, you are required to analyze that Sharia law as if it was real because it's real to them. Just take some of your analysts and analyze it as if the Islamic world meant what they said when they post treaties. And remember, this treaty wouldn't have been served had the heads of states not been on board with it. So, here we have this observatory report. The OIC puts out an observatory report on it seems like an annual basis right now. And what do they say here? Everybody will agree with the first part of the sentence. It's Section H. And this came out in 2010. It should be recognized that Muslims have the same basic needs and desires as others, which are material well-being, cultural acceptance, and religious freedom, without political or social intimidation. I don't know of anybody I work with who would disagree with that, but it's this next language that kind of causes us to think about what's being said here. In that vein, Muslims should not be marginalized or attempted to be assimilated, but should be accommodated. Accommodation is the best strategy for integration. Because you could really read that to say that they have a right to come to the United States, but not assimilate into the American community. To come to the United States and live under their law while you live under your law. Does it say that? And by the way, does the OIC claim jurisdiction over Muslims and non-Muslim states, including the United States? I'm not asking you to unilaterally agree. I'm just saying you can't unilaterally disagree until you do the due diligence research on this and find out for yourself. Clearly something is being said here. Why shouldn't the American people have a right to expect that when somebody moves to this country to live, they agree to become American citizens and abides by the laws of the United States of America to the exclusion of the legal systems they came from? We do that with everybody else. So, there's an Muslim Brotherhood OIC tag team effort. Let's see how this works. Okay, I'd like to point out a book came out last year by a woman named Bat Yor, Europe, Globalization, and the Coming Universal Caliphate. And one of the interesting things she says in her book, actually comes out in the footnote to the very beginning of the book, is this whole concept of Islamic centers was kind of the brainchild of Saeed Ramadan back in 1974 that the OIC seems to have been on board with since 1974. I just think it's worth pointing out because we're talking about this OIC-MB kind of convergence on events, and this is something pushing it all the way back to the 1970s. 1974 is an important year because that would be the year after we were embargoed for backing Israel in the 73 war.
Who was Saeed Ramadan?
Oh, and who is Saeed Ramadan? Saeed Ramadan would happen to be the son-in-law of the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, Hassan al-Banna. He would also be the father of Tariq Ramadan, a luminary in the Islamic world, someone who was not allowed admittance to the United States until the current Secretary of State let him come into this country back in 2010, I do believe. I think it was 2010. So, an interesting factoid is that back in the 1950s, Saeed Ramadan did come to the United States. He met with the Eisenhower administration, and in the notes, they clearly wrote a glyph that he was clearly a fascist. So there is tracking on this man. So let's move on. Here we have combating Islamophobia, and it's in a document here, and I think it's very important to take a look at this. Some people have written articles. Some people have made it their life event to say that this guy, Steve Coughlin, is talking about this 10-year plan, suggesting I'm wearing tinfoil on my head and making this stuff up. But here we have something called an Islamic summit, and it was back in the year 2005. Now, if it's an Islamic summit, it means it was all the heads of states of the Muslim world. And here we see that there's a 10-year program of action that's being announced in 2005. And so in 2005, the heads of states of all the Muslim countries are announcing to the world an OIC summit, a 10-year plan that includes combating Islamophobia. So, what does it say? Let's cut to the chase and go to paragraph 3. To endeavor to have the United Nations adopt an international resolution to counter Islamophobia and call upon all states to enact laws to counter it, including deterrent punishment. So, making Islamophobia a crime in every jurisdiction. Well, I will argue that the term Islamophobia is actually Islamic law of slander. Islamic law of slander, not Western notions of slander, which holds, among other things, that Westerners really can't have a voice in Islam outside of what Islam allows it to have. And that the IIIT, back I do believe in the 1970s, or maybe it was the 80s, created the word Islamophobia because they saw how useful the word homophobia was, and the OIC adopted it. So the word Islamophobia is actually a term created by the Muslim Brotherhood, adopted by the OIC, to fit into the Western postmodern narrative that is supposed to mean one thing to us, but actually, when you scratch beneath the surface, is really Islamic law on what non-Muslims are allowed to say. So, and of course, we're prepared to back that statement up. So, what does it say here? Isn't this the OIC making an extraterritorial demand? Aren't they making a demand on non-Muslim on the non-Muslim world of what they can say, and demanding that the non-Muslim world punish people for defaming Islam? If the United States was to pass such a law, wouldn't that be a direct assault on the First Amendment of the Constitution? Of course, the answer is there's no question about it. This question will come back to haunt us. So, Article 2 of that same Combating Islamophobia affirmed the need to counter Islamophobia through the establishment of an observatory at the OIC General Secretariat to monitor all forms of Islamophobia, issue an annual report thereon, and ensure cooperation with the relevant government and non-governmental organizations in order to counter Islamophobia. So the Muslim world is creating, official Muslim world is creating an observatory to monitor the rest of the world on whether they're defaming Islam, so they can direct that those people who are non-Muslim citizens of non-Muslim states can be punished. So let's have a quick little review here of what is this concept of slander in Islam. First, I'd like to point out that in the Pact of Umar, you will see that one of the things that was required was that the Christians of Syria were said that we will not teach our children the Quran, which has been understood to mean that the understanding of Islam coming into the dhimmi population, the submitted non-Muslim population, is not to come from the parents but through the Islamic authority. And that understanding is really pretty close to the same authority that exists for Muslims living in Islamic society. So they're not actually holding non-Muslims accountable to something they wouldn't hold to a Muslim. So what is slander? Well, we're going to take a look at reliance of the traveler. First slander, section R 2.0. The prophet said, the talebearer will not enter paradise. It goes on and it says, do you know what slander is? It is to mention of your brother that which he would dislike. 3. The Muslim is the brother of the Muslim. He does not betray him, lie to him, or hang back from coming to his aid. All of the Muslim is inviolable to his fellow Muslim. Now this is a different definition of slander. And it's an associated term here called talebearing. Okay? In fact, talebearing is not limited to that, but rather consists of revealing anything whose disclosure is resented. The reality of talebearing lies in divulging a secret and revealing something confidential whose disclosure is resented. A person should not speak of anything he knows about people besides that which benefits a Muslim. Now, this is not the Western definition of slander. Anything that does not benefit a Muslim, anything that does not benefit Islam, anything that does not benefit something in the Islamic world can be understood to be talebearing, or in the broader use of the term, slander. So I point this out because I use this as a shorthand discussion of it. We could populate a whole 2-hour brief with all the definitions surrounding this Islamic concept of slander to make it clear that what I'm saying is not taking license with any of what we're seeing. So, combating Islamophobia, the requirement was issued, and here in 2006, May 2006, the Khaleej Times came out and said, hey, that observatory is being stood up. And here we have 4 editions of the OIC observatory. The 5th one should be out any day now. As far as I know, it may well be out. But this last one came out in 2011. So, and we quoted from the 3rd observatory about 5 minutes ago. So I'd like to point out that the Islamic world has set up a forum to monitor all speech in the world for the purposes of subverting it. So they're making a claim to come into the United States and to tell an American citizen who is not Muslim what he can or cannot say if it violates Islamic law, which they will designate as Islamophobia. Why is that not an assault on an American citizen's First Amendment right? How could a U.S. government official even countenance the idea of entertaining enforcement of that? So, Islamophobia is an OIC created brand, adopted through the IIIT, International Institute of Islamic Thought, and it enforces it like a brand. It means it retains positive enforcement of that term. So when you hear it, I want you to think Islamophobia when you hear, for example, the Secretary of State, or someone in the Department of Justice, or someone at DHS Civil Rights Civil Liberties Division to say that an American citizen is engaging in Islamophobia. You should now start understanding that what they are doing is enforcing a hostile foreign law against an American citizen over and above their constitutional right to free speech. This is horrific. So, here you have the head of the OIC saying that adoption of genocide law is a sign of Islamophobia. Figure that. So, what I'd like to do is, one of the things this brings us to is the question of, we're talking about this Muslim Brotherhood OIC convergence. Okay, what we're going to do is take a look at the 9/11 Commission report. This is easily one of the most quoted things from all the stuff I've briefed. It has been briefed on the floor of Congress multiple times by more than a couple of congressmen. So what I'd like to do is point out here that MPAC was asked to testify at one of the hearings on the 9/11 Commission. And I just wonder how many other religious organizations were asked to do that. But we do know that you hear Islamic entities, the Muslim Brotherhood in America, constantly say that Islam rejects all forms of terrorism. And they do. Remember, jihad is not terrorism. Remember? Because terrorism in the Islamic lexicon is the killing of a Muslim without right. So, what you have here is the OIC's asked, so you'll hear Islamic entities say Islam condemns all forms of terrorism, but there'll be a little comma there somewhere in most of the statements, and you take it in the large picture, and you will find that condemns all forms of terrorism condemned by Islam. So that's not inaccurate if you understand the Islamic legal understanding of what was said there. But here what happened is MPAC said terminology is important to defining our goals. The 9/11 Commission identifies Islamist terrorism as the threat. The Muslim Public Affairs Council recommends that the U.S. government find other terminology. You know what this is? This is an overt call to reject the 9/11 Commission's findings by rejecting the language they use to define the issue. I want to point out this is how the enemy in the war on terror plans to win the war. Okay? By making it too politically costly for you to even say what it is when there's no question about what it is. And there's no question that most Americans know what it is, and they know that you're not saying it. So, by replacing the terminology with one that is subordinate to MPAC's narrative. So, the law is Islamic law of slander. The standard was set forth by the OIC when they came up with the 10-year plan, and they expect the Muslim Brotherhood in America, in the United States, because we're talking about the U.S., to enforce it. So let's see how this played out. Okay? So here we have the 9/11 Commission, and then we have the FBI Counterterrorism Lexicon that came out in 2008 in the Bush administration, and then we have the National Intelligence Strategy that came out in 2009, the Obama administration. And what we see is a total purging of the language. In fact, the word enemy was purged. I like to point out that the Constitution says that we will support and defend against all enemies. So once we were convinced not to use the word enemy, we were actually off our legal basis to operate. Think about that. Because this is not about, by the way, I'm not looking to charge anybody with treason on this. I'm pointing out that the other side's goal is to delegitimize the war in our own mind. And when they convinced our senior leaders that we couldn't use the word enemy, they were halfway there. Okay? Because once you get past the fact that our military only exists to support and defend against all enemies, then we're articulating something that they can't match up with what we're doing. So, jihad was used 126 times in the 9/11 Commission, but it wasn't used at all in either the official FBI lexicon or in the National Intelligence Strategy. At a time when we had troops in both Iraq and Afghanistan. We still have troops in Afghanistan. Muslim, 145 times, but not once in either of those two documents. Islam, 322 times in the Big Goose Egg. What you're seeing is a total sanitizing of the lexicon. Let's take a look at Al-Qaeda. The FBI Counterterrorism Lexicon never mentioned it. The National Intelligence Strategy did. It said something to the effect of one example of violent extremists are groups like Al-Qaeda. So, I will argue that the point at which you cannot define the enemy in factual terms is the point at which you can't do Sun Tzu. Okay? And you know what? Everybody knows that, except the people doing the planning. Why? Because they have an anthropologist, or they have a psychosocial theorist, or they have a political scientist, all of which exist to tell you, or them, that you can do something, you can talk about something without naming it, and then convince yourself that you're saying something that means something. That's why I think the whole combating violent extremist narrative is subversive. There's a whole lot of other reasons too. So, the 9/11 Commission was completely undermined. I would call this a decisive victory in the information battle space. The destruction of factual analysis by the removal of words that define, supplanted by the illusion of knowledge where none exists. And I'm telling you, there's no knowledge in the violent extremism narrative. None. If a violent extremist can apply to my daughter who gets in a fight during recess, the same way it applies to Al-Qaeda, the same way it applies to the Germans of World War II, if it can mean all that, it actually means nothing at all. So, here we have an example of it being briefed on the floor of Congress. And here we have Protecting the Force, Lessons from Fort Hood, 2010. Why do I like to point this out? Because this was a blue ribbon panel. It was called for by the Secretary of Defense, and we had an admiral and a former Secretary of the Army oversee the study. And here we have it. The word violent extremist is not even used. We have the huge goose egg in all the language that defines. So how does one talk about Major Hassan, who said he was acting in the name of Islam, was in contact with Al-Qaeda, okay, was in contact with the Muslim Brotherhood, okay, declared himself a jihadi, okay? How do we talk about Major Hassan? Said he was a soldier of Islam. How do we talk about Major Hassan and never use any of that language that defines him? And the answer is, you don't. The minute we do that word search, we already know this is a bogus document. We already know that. Now here's the thing. We go brief senior people, they get all defensive. We brief everywhere else, they're appalled. Okay? They're simply appalled. How do you talk about Major Hassan and the protecting the force without using that language? The answer is simple. Just don't mention Major Hassan in the report. And of course, he was not named. I mean, really. How do you deal with something that the weekend after the Fort Hood event on the Stephanopoulos show, you had a senior military official spend more time voicing his concern about the protection of Muslims in the military than the death of those people who were killed? So, I have an asterisk there because there was an article that was footnoted that used the word violent Islamic extremists, but that was only by way of a footnote and they were not actually mentioned. In case someone challenges me, it's just this simple. You cannot defeat an enemy you will not define. And you know what? This was cutting information when Sun Tzu said it 500 years BC. It is still true today. But I will tell you something. It's not just that we can't name the enemy. It's that there's something about ourselves that our senior national security planners are missing, that they don't understand, that someone's got the jump on them in the information battle space. They know something about you that you don't know, that they realize they could convince you of something totally ridiculous, completely ridiculous, that you could come up with this quasi-bureaucratic, quasi-academic, soft science language to pretend to define, in abstract terms, a real ongoing mission where we have troops actually in combat, actually getting killed. So I will argue we don't know ourselves and we don't know the enemy. And I think the enemy knows that. So if you cannot talk about this, how do you talk about articles as simple as this? The Tehran Times that came out in February, Ismail Haniyeh says jihad is only strategy for Islamic Ummah. So we cannot say jihad, we cannot say Islamic, and we cannot say Ummah. Just think about the normal articles that we have to pretend don't mean what they say. Okay? If the Islamic Ummah is the Ummah, then that would be the OIC, because the OIC says that they are the Ummah. And yes, Iran is a member. So, not making any hard points there. I'm just showing you that this language is ubiquitously used, and we've convinced that we can't even use the words. There is no mystery here, and there never was. This is not hard. In fact, it's very simple. What makes it hard is that we have to take the core language out and talk in circles around it until we confuse ourselves. Here we have it. We're still talking about the 10-year plan, the OIC's 10-year plan, and I would like to point out that here we've had these days of rage. We're looking here at the one that happened to General Petraeus, and I want to point out that the days of rage are about enforcing the 10-year plan. What am I saying here? We're here talking about we're still here talking about the 10-year plan, and this story here is about the 10-year plan. Here's a day of rage. We're talking about General Petraeus when he was still in Afghanistan, and what is he talking about? What is this about? This is about the Quran burning. Now I will tell you, this is about the OIC implementing its 10-year plan. How does it work? It works this way. You have an event that catches the Western world. I'm using the Western world as the example. Here, General Petraeus in Afghanistan. You have an event that explodes right in front of them. While they're disoriented, they make demands. And then what they do is they get our senior leader to make a statement that goes after a U.S. interest. So here we have a minister who burned a Quran in Florida, and there was a day of rage. Okay? I'm going to get to the story in more full detail, but what I want to focus on right now is the days of rage that we are seeing are in furtherance of the OIC's 10-year plan, which is kind of raising the specter that maybe these things are not just, generated from nowhere. In fact, they hardly are. Let's take a look. So, you did not hear in the news that some minister in Florida burned a Quran, and then on a small fuse you heard about riots in urban Afghanistan where the population is educated enough to read the news, and then there was a day of rage. You heard about a day of rage in an Afghani backwater, Mazar-e-Sharif, where most of the population is illiterate, okay? And then you heard from the fact that they were rioting in this day of rage that it was about a minister burning a Quran in Florida. That's when that story first hit the news, despite the fact that it had happened many weeks, I think a couple months prior. Why is this important? Because that day of rage was orchestrated. Okay, it was an orchestrated event. Think about it. The only people killed were who? UN employees. Well, where do they seek to implement the 10-year plan through or from? The United Nations. But I want to point out, it is simply not possible in a backwater of Afghanistan for these people to have coordinated riots that could literally shock our national leadership. So much so that they could predict that our national leaders would say, I think that an American citizen exercising their First Amendment right inside the United States is something that should not be done because it puts our troops at risk. Well, our troops are at risk in a war to protect exactly that right. Now, I wouldn't want to be someone who was killed in that situation, but it seems to me that we're in Afghanistan because people claim the right to kill for that reason, and that's why they hit the Twin Towers and the Pentagon. So I have a very hard time with this, but I also have a hard time with this. If these days of rage are coordinated events that are in furtherance of the 10-year plan that the OIC has initiated on behalf of its member states, then these days of rage are have some degree of approval, if not actual facilitation, through OIC organs. And we know all the whisper campaigns about how much Karzai knew about these events. Okay? So that would make it not Al-Qaeda. Please think about that. Okay? But here's the other thing. If our senior leaders in Afghanistan truly were shocked by this explosive day of rage, doesn't that say that we're in a situation just like the Tet Offensive? That this kind of thing could happen right before our eyes and surprise us? But doesn't that say that we're not nearly as involved as we'd like? Of course, our senior leaders in Afghanistan like to talk about green on blue violence. The troops talk about being killed by their Afghan compatriots. So, here we have it. The thing about this is, go back to 2005, December 2005. That's when the 10-year plan was passed. And in January 2006 was the first time I was a civilian, I was out of the Army, I was not advising anybody, and I wrote an email to people at the Joint Staff, at OSD, Office of Secretary of Defense, and at Special Operations Command saying, watch out, this is in January, watch out, because there's something coming down the line with this thing that's happened in Europe. Some newspaper published cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad, and there's going to be a big explosion. And they kind of looked at me and said, hey, we have more important things. And they kind of blew it off. But I remember giving pure warning of that, so much so that in March of 2006, I was asked to go to a SOCOM conference to explain how it was that the cartoon crisis could have been predicted. And of course, what you saw were two things. Elite Islamic entities, elite Islamic heads of state and foreign ministries, and senior Muslim Brotherhood were all getting on the same talking point about the cartoons, and they were building up. It was in all the newspapers. So what I was saying is, watch out. It's so easy to see. And of course it happened. What else has happened? Well, I think we've provided warning. We've been able to provide warning on these on these days of rage ever since. What's the objectives of these days of rage? To get us to overrule the First Amendment of the United States by subordinating it to Islamic law. That's what it is. Think about it. There was a fair and balanced evening program, and the person said, well, you know, the difference between Christians and Jews on the one hand, in America, and Muslims is if you say dirty Christian, the Christians aren't going to get angry. So we don't need a law to make that illegal. But it's like yelling fire in a movie theater. We should have a law for saying dirty Muslim because they will get mad. Does anybody remember that? Therefore, there should be a law for that because it creates violence. You know what that is? That is the battered wife syndrome. Think about that. So, what I'd like to point out is the whole thing is about to dislocate us and detach us from our free speech. The free speech that our soldiers have took an oath to protect and defend. And they've done it against a whole lot of people. So, it's also worth pointing out that the same Central Command that came out violently against the burning of Qurans earlier this year, the second Afghan Day of Rage, where there's the same command that burned a whole bunch of Bibles. And I just think that consistency is there. There's also a lot of indication that that whole burning Quran event was a little more planned and a little more coordinated than we'd like to understand, not the least of which I'm told that the troops who burned the Quran did it on the advice of their Afghan counterparts. So here we have a whole series of events that had netted days of rage since then. You had the cartoon crisis. You had the Day of Rage following Pope Benedict's Regensburg speech. In fact, did people die? Yes. Who died? I do believe a nun died. Think of that. Okay. You have the fact that the knighting of Salman Rushdie had Pakistan's Minister of Religious Affairs come out and say that this would call for suicide bombings. You had Geert Wilders getting targeted for a lawsuit on defamation of Islam. You had a UN resolution of 2009 that had the effect of subordinating UN concepts of free speech to the 10-year plan. So we've been following these days of rage for a very long time, and we've kept a pretty good record of it. So now here we have it. It is July 15th, 2011, and here you have the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, in Istanbul, Turkey, sitting right next to the head of the OIC, Aklemedin Isinoglu, and she makes a series of commitments. And here it is, the State Department's official release on it, her comments. I want to go through quickly, but it talks about her praising work being done on Resolution 1618. And what is Resolution 1618? It is the current round of UN resolutions to try to give effect to the OIC's 10-year plan. So we take a look at one of the drafts of Resolution 1618 because some of this language filtered out, so the fingerprints weren't as obvious. But what does it say here? Well, on paragraph 16, Pakistan, on behalf of the Organization Islamic Conference, put this draft language in. Okay? And on note 5, notes the speech given by Secretary General of the OIC, Aklemedin Isinoglu, and how it influenced this drafting of 1618. So we know 1618 is actually concerned with the OIC's 10-year plan. Now, let's go through here. Secretary Clinton congratulates the UN and the European Union and the OIC on making this work. But why are we letting these foreign entities become the new arbiters of free speech in America? I think the phrase we want to hit hard here, because we'll cut to the quick, is as part of praising the passage of UN Resolution 1618, the Secretary of State said that in protecting the rights of all people to worship as they choose, and to use some old-fashioned techniques of peer pressure and shaming so that people don't feel that they have the support to do what we abhor. Well, I'm really struggling with that because peer pressure and shaming, when was it the Secretary of State's mission to bring peer pressure and shaming against an American citizen in the exercise of their First Amendment right? And doesn't it say that there's a series of conclusions that have been met? For example, that when they said something, that it was something that deserved peer pressure and shaming. But think about this. Speaking officially in a foreign country to a foreign leader, because it is a Secretary General, it is a foreign entity. When was it ever okay for a Secretary of State to commit to peer pressure and shaming of an American citizen inside the United States for exercising their First Amendment right? I just find this astonishing. But you know, being a government entity, they're not supposed to be involved in peer pressure and shaming. So I almost instantly associate peer pressure and shaming with the term extra-legal, meaning maybe they know they don't have a legal basis to go after American citizens for voicing their views, but they can use extra-legal means. I just think peer pressure and shaming, when the U.S. federal government comes down on an American citizen, that sounds to me like an awful lot of intimidation. So, here we have it. An article came out. It says, religious tolerance resolution backed by Obama administration aligns with Islamic bloc's interest. This is just a article quoting the Secretary General of the OIC saying, let me see if I have it here. The head of the Organization Islamic Cooperation has acknowledged that a UN religious tolerance resolution heavily promoted by the Obama administration has the same aims as the Islamic bloc's annual religious defamation resolutions, which Western democracies have consistently opposed for more than a decade. So what's he doing? I think he's laughing, the head of the OIC. So, what else does it say? It says the State Department this week hosted a 3-day talk with foreign governments. This was December 2011. So the United States hosted the event that would cause the passage of UN Resolution 1618. Talks with foreign governments and international organizations, including the OIC, on implementing Resolution 1618 by consensus without a vote. Oh, I didn't vote for it. It was a consensus vote. Can you believe that? They worked hard to get a resolution passed at the UN that they weren't even to put their names on having passed, but they committed to its passage. So you'll hear a speech. We never voted for it. So a law from a foreign entity can be imposed on an American citizen, in theory, based on nothing other than a consensus vote. That's incredible to me. So, it was hailed as a shift away from earlier defamation of Islam, which was later changed to defamation of religion, resolutions that was introduced by the OIC. It's here we're going to go through a little vignette, a little deep dive on Islamic law, just to make it clear what I said earlier. When an Islamic entity says defamation of religion, they mean only defamation of Islam. And I want to give you a sense for how solid this is. Believe me, we could take this a much more solid. But what does an Islamic entity mean by defamation of Islam? Well, recall that the Cairo Declaration of Human Rights in Islam says that when we say things having to do with human rights, etc., or when we talk about war or terrorism, we mean only what Sharia law means. So we have to take what they mean about defamation of religion, an entity that says they're beholden to Sharia law, and apply the Sharia definitions for that. Let's see what could possibly be met. We'll go to Reliance of the Traveler, the book published in Beltsville, Maryland, an official English language translation, and let me read it through. Previously revealed religions were valid in their own eras, as is attested to by many verses of the Holy Quran, but were abrogated by the universal message of Islam, as is equally attested to by many verses of the Quran. Both points are worthy of attention from English-speaking Muslims who are occasionally exposed to erroneous theories advanced by some teachers and Quran translators, affirming their religion's validity, but denying or not mentioning their abrogation, or that it is unbelief, kufr, to hold that the remnant cults now bearing the names of formerly valid religions such as Christianity or Judaism are acceptable to Allah Most High after He sent His final messenger. This is a matter over which there is no disagreement among the scholars. To give you a sense for how strong this language is, they sandwiched it between two legal concepts. That if you hold this belief, if you hold this view that Christianity and Judaism are valid, it's unbelief. And all the scholars agree. Well, what does it mean when all the scholars agree? Well, let me read it to you right here out of Islamic law. When the four necessary integrals of consensus exist, and we don't have to go into them, the ruling agreed upon is an authoritative part of sacred Islamic law that is obligatory to obey and not lawful to disobey. Nor can mujahids, legal authorities, of a succeeding era make the thing the object of new ijtihad, because the ruling on it, verified by scholarly consensus, is an absolute legal ruling which does not admit to being contravened or annulled. So here it is. You have your moderate friends say there are no absolute rules in Islam. Oh, they also tell you there's no abrogation. But here we're watching both of them in effect at the same time in the same paragraph. Previously revealed religions were abrogated, and this is an absolute rule. That sentence there, nor can mujahids of a succeeding era make the thing the object of new ijtihad, means that once there's consensus, it can never be reopened for future consideration. You want to disagree? Fine. You get me published Islamic law that breaks from this authoritatively, and we'll put it out there. But it's irrelevant to this discussion because this is the book we find in most mosque-associated bookstores. So we know this is the information put out. So what are they saying? All of Islam agrees with this definition. So you're saying, well, I'm going to break from that. Well, maybe you will, maybe you won't. But remember I talked about kufr, unbelief? Well, let's take a look at this. Let's go to the book of chapter on apostasy. Whoever voluntarily leaves Islam is killed. And it gives us a better definition. When a person who has reached puberty and is sane voluntarily apostatizes from Islam, he deserves to be killed. I remember a couple years ago, there was a girl who left her father, and the big concern was that because she left Islam, she apostatized, and somebody from a Muslim Brotherhood front group said, we don't put people to death for apostasy. And then he kind of looked into it, well, we put them to death for finding out they apostatized. And it was kind of there's a technical sense in which that's true. You're never convicted of a crime. You're convicted that you got caught committing the crime. And that's what they meant by it. But you see, when they're saying it's unbelief, this goes to the question of apostasy. So if you believe it, you're an apostate, and all the scholars of Islam agree that that is true. But it goes one step further. It says, that same definition of apostasy tells us acts that entail leaving Islam, meaning if you do this, you're guilty of apostasy. Among the things that entail apostasy from Islam are 7, deny any verse of the Quran or anything which by scholarly consensus belongs to it, or to add a verse that does not belong to it. And 14, to deny the obligatory character of something which by consensus of the Muslims is a part of Islam. So you see, inside that statement that formerly valid religions have been abrogated, such as Christianity or Judaism, you see that it's unbelief to think it. All the scholars agree, and if you disagree with that, it's also apostasy. I mean, they couldn't have put solar flares on that definition, more solar flares on that definition had they tried. So, when an entity says they follow Islamic law, says religion, guess what? They mean, and they only mean, and they mean nothing else but Islam. Okay? So, the Secretary of State Hillary Clinton on Wednesday told the closing session of the meeting at the State Department that the adoption of Resolution 1618 had ended 10 years of divisive debate where people were not listening to each other anymore. The greening of the First Amendment. That's what I'd call it. Okay? They were listening to each other, the people who opposed it. They saw this as an unbridled attack on Western notions of free speech that are embedded in the First Amendment of the Constitution of the United States. Sometimes the goal is not to agree. Now here's an interesting story here. Interpol accused after journalists arrested over a Muhammad tweet. You heard about this. I think a man in Saudi Arabia said something on his tweet which is defamatory against the Prophet Muhammad, and I'll concede that it was. Okay? Realizing he was in trouble, he hopped a plane. He was going to go to, I think, New Zealand, and there he was in Malaysia, and someone, based on a tweet, called Interpol and had him detained. I just like to point out that that's kind of scary stuff, because according to Islamic law, he should have been detained. But what is this about Interpol detaining people for just religious law, unless, of course, that religious law was actually the law of the land, which it is in both Malaysia, I do believe, and in Saudi Arabia. So, by the way, who was just a huge investor in Twitter? Who just invested, what was it, $300 million? Some large amount of money. Oh, we'll find out later. Who was a big investor in Twitter? Prince Al-Walid bin Talal, Saudi Arabian prince. So, very interesting. So, with the U.S. State Department facilitating passage of UN Resolution 1618, an executive order giving Interpol a free hand, could Interpol undertake such an action against the U.S. person inside the United States? Now, before you accuse me of putting, foil on my head, I'm not actually arguing that this is going to happen in the near term. I'm not even actually going to happen at all. I'm asking, is the legal framework being cleared for such a possibility that now that idea can be entertained? What am I talking about? I'm talking about presidential directive here that came out over the Christmas season in 2009. It was an executive order that effectively put Interpol beyond the jurisdiction of the State Department, of the Justice Department, or the FBI. So in effect, they can operate in the United States with a free hand. Now, you can hear some major theorizing about that. For example, that its principal target are the International Court of Justice for U.S. combat soldiers in war, that they be detained in the event that gets passed. But all I'd like to point out is Interpol theoretically could now undertake such an investigation of an American citizen inside the United States without having to worry about Miranda, constitutional rights, or anything like that. So, I just think that maybe that is an infringement on Article 6 of the Constitution. And if an entity was given that much latitude, shouldn't there at least be some kind of congressional oversight? Not to mention, approval. I mean, an approval that would have to be actually an amendment overriding the Constitution? Because there seems to be a deferment. There were red flags that came out about this. We had whole bunch of articles. I'm just going to blow past them here. But when it happened, there was some reporting on this. Forbes did, the Canadian Free Press, and even National Review Online. So what could this mean? Well, I just like to point out that there's certain things about, there's a framework being put in place that gives the theoretical possibility for something like this to happen. So here we have, I was just kind of going over, and we'll go back to a little bit of it, but we just looked at the official State Department communique of Secretary Hillary Clinton's statements at the July 15th OIC conference. And you know what? The OIC had their official press release as well. And I'd just like to point out what they were saying. Okay? Make no mistake about it. What Hillary Clinton agreed to in the 15 July 2011 meeting was an agreement to put in motion the execution of the OIC 10-year plan against the First Amendment. There's the entire communique right there for those who want to read it. In her statement, U.S. Secretary Clinton said that at the Istanbul meeting, it is one of the events that has great ramifications beyond this room. Yes, it has great ramifications beyond this room, and it affects our understanding of our own Constitution. The statement stated that the participants resolved to go beyond mere rhetoric. The UN High Commissioner of Human Rights, Ambassador Salama, said the true challenge now is indeed to give practical effect to the resolution, and we should understand that to be a call to action. Would you agree? So, the resolution 1618 was driven more by a kind of discrimination in Europe and the West in general than against Muslims. I'd like you to read that statement closely, because what's being said here is that this resolution does not affect Muslims. It only affects non-Muslims. So how is it that a country that is predominantly not Muslim, the United States, how is it they would affect a resolution that that would have no reciprocity to the other side in terms of what's being passed? I mean, I just think this is totally strange. So, Ambassador Donahoe, the U.S. is willing to host in the fall of this year the first roll-up-your-sleeves, hands-on meeting to discuss actions that the states can and should be taking to combat intolerance in their own society. I just don't know when the State Department was ever authorized to do that on behalf of the U.S. citizens. But more importantly, we can see that the State Department is leading the charge on getting this passed. This gives real meaning to the Muslim Brotherhood's civilization jihad by your hand, meaning we're going to get you to destroy your own concepts of freedom. So I'd like to just end by pointing out this last point. Implementing this resolution to the fullest will not be easy, as some of the actions required may face opposition from political factions or indeed certain pockets in society. But the cost of non-action will always be even higher. Isn't that a veiled threat? Isn't it? I mean, just think about it. So, your constitutional rights negotiated away to the OIC through a UN forum in furtherance of implementing the OIC's 10-year plan to make Islamic notions of slander a crime in every jurisdiction, including the United States, where the United States Department of State is actually leading the charge. I just feel like I'm in a bad movie, and I suspect many of you do too. All of these here, as you will see with most of my slides, have citations and links to get all this information. This is not going to be disproven, okay? This is not going to be met with a competing argument that is going to match this. We're going right to the primary documents. It's not just that the State Department is doing this. It's that it is completely in the interest of a third party, not the United States, in the foreign policy world. The OIC know exactly what they got: submission of the First Amendment of the Constitution to Islamic law of defamation through the multicultural device of Islamophobia, a term the OIC constructed for just that purpose. So, here we have some language here. Article 20. Article 20 says what? This is the International Covenant on Civil Rights and Political Rights, and this is why I think we're limited to old-fashioned techniques of peer pressure and shaming, because the language says in the underlying treaty, the International Covenant on Civil Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 20 says any propaganda for war shall be prohibited by law. But number 2 is the important one. Any advocacy of national, racial, or religious hatred that constitutes incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence shall be prohibited by law. Now, what is being said here? What's being said here is, think about it. It's 1962, we're in Mississippi, and the leader of the Ku Klux Klan gives a speech, and he's inciting members of the Ku Klux Klan to go out. He's inciting violence to get them to go out and do something. That is what that language intends. What is the Muslim Brotherhood and the OIC saying incitement to violence is? You said something that you had a right to say. It got us mad, and we decided to kill somebody or to intimidate them. Okay? Think about this. I'm going to give you a corollary. A woman who's married says something, and her much larger husband doesn't like it, and he beats her. And he says, you caused yourself to get beaten because you said something I didn't want to hear. Okay? So you incited me to violence. Please, don't make me hurt you again. So, shut up. That's what this is. And that is not what Article 20 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights intended. This is the battered wife syndrome as a foreign policy objective. And it's crazy and it's wrong. What I'd like to do now is turn your attention to an organization almost nobody's ever heard of, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, that up until recently was called the Organization of Islamic Conference. Why? Because among the entities out there that I have talked about, very few seem to have been so large and yet at the same time so unknown to the viewing public. Now, I've gone to very, very rarefied briefings by many members of the senior military and national security in the national security space. And I will ask, who here has ever heard of the OIC? And you might get out of 100 senior military officers or people, civilians in equal status, some answer like, well, that would be the officer in charge. You just kind of say, wow, what's that all about? The total lack of understanding of who these people are. I tell you, it's like not knowing what the Warsaw Pact was in the Soviet Union. It's just incredible to me. So if I know that a room full of people who are national security planners in the war on terror are unfamiliar with the OIC, I actually know they know nothing about what's going on. Because I will say, this is the very public, invisible entity. So let's just take a look at it. And I'll ask you if you would agree that if I could prove that this entity is real and we don't know about it, doesn't it mean we're basically fighting a war almost blind? Let's take a look. So what we'll do is we'll go to their webpage, the Organization of Islamic Conference, now the Cooperation. And what does it say? It says about the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Conference is the second largest intergovernmental organization after the United Nations, which has a membership of 57 states, actually 56 and the Palestinian Authority. They just redid their charter back in 2008. The organization is the collective voice of the Muslim world. Well, think about this, please. If this entity is able to represent all 57 member states, they may well be able to make that claim. But if not, well, we'll see. And of course, they redid their charter. So who is this OIC? Well, when they meet as a summit, an Islamic summit, they are composed of kings and heads of states and governments and of the member states. So, think about that. If the OIC is what it purports to be, and they meet at a summit level, they would actually represent the entire Muslim world, wouldn't they? This would be true. And we don't know it exists. Think about it. What would happen if they passed treaties as the OIC that we didn't know about? Would it be possible for there to be two foreign policies running parallel? One for unity and religious and cultural identity of Muslim communities and minorities in non-Muslim states. The United States would be a non-Muslim state. Does this mean that the OIC is claiming jurisdiction over Muslims inside the United States? Because to read that, that's certainly in the zone. So, let's take a look at this. How many of you have ever heard of the Cairo Declaration on Human Rights in Islam? It was promulgated by the OIC in 1990, and here it is coming from their official webpage. And it's very important to know that the OIC has designated English as an official language, so that when the OIC publishes their information on an English language website, it's official in that language. But just as importantly, in 1993, the OIC submitted the Cairo Declaration on Human Rights in Islam to the United Nations. So, we have been on legal notice, the entire world, that the Cairo Declaration on Human Rights in Islam is what guides human rights in the Islamic world. We're not going to go through the entire Cairo Declaration. We'll just go through the last two articles. And we'll note that we will have an article of inclusion. When we say this, we mean X, followed by an article of exclusion. And when we say X, we don't mean that. Let's take a look. Article 24 of the Cairo Declaration on Human Rights in Islam says, all the rights and freedoms stipulated in this declaration are subject to the Islamic Sharia. So when we say human rights, we mean Sharia. And what does Article 25 say? Article 25 says, the Islamic Sharia is the only source of reference for the explanation or clarification of any of the articles of this declaration. So, and when we say human rights, we mean nothing else but. Now this has huge and one that kind of is operative inside the Islamic world, where one side is aware of both and one side is barely aware of one. So, let's take a look. They meet every year at the foreign ministers meet once a year. Who do we represent when they meet at when the OIC meets? Well, they put Ummah in the mission scope. It's very important because Ummah is one of the words the Department of Homeland Security says we're not supposed to use because it has a religious connotation. But here, the OIC says that when the heads of states of the Muslim world meet, in Chapter 5, the Islamic Summit, when they say they meet, they deliberate issues of concern to member states and the Ummah. When they have extraordinary sessions, it will be held whenever the interests of the Ummah warrant. So, the Ummah, the Muslim nation, the Muslim community, well, I guess I would have to say that if this is true, and of course it is, that if the summit meets and all the heads of states are there, they would be the Ummah. So, the Council of Foreign Ministers will deal with specific issues of concern to the Ummah. So, what else do we have? Well, the Secretary General of the OIC, a man named Eklemadin Isanoglu, he's been quoted more than once suggesting, but here's one we have here, that the OIC fulfills the function of a caliphate and embodies the Islamic solidarity that it once held. I will argue that the OIC is the proto-caliphate, and that the OIC, if it's on its current trajectory, will become the caliphate. So, what's very important to realize is when you take a look at the OIC charter, it says that one of the things its mission is to do is to assist Muslim minorities and communities outside the member states. In fact, Chapter 1, Article 1 goes on to say, to safeguard the rights to consequences. If the OIC, which is represented by the Muslim world at the head of state level, promulgates this Cairo Declaration on behalf of all its member states, what it means is they have told every country in the world officially that when they say human rights, they mean Sharia law and they mean nothing else. Now, think about this. If we know that most of our senior analysts know nothing about the OIC, they will have no substantive understanding about the Cairo Declaration on Human Rights in Islam. And yet this is a game changer. This should be changing how we understand what is communicated to us. For example, if the head of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt says they support human rights, or if CARE says that they are the Muslim civil rights entity in America, we should know that by definition, by their treaty, they mean that they are there to implement Sharia, that they define human rights as Sharia. So, it's important. So, this gives rise to a rule. We'll call it a rule of interpretation. Any analysis undertaken on subject matter where the OIC, an OIC member state, or initiatives reasonably arising out of either speaks of rights and freedoms or associated defined terms that arise out of the Cairo Declaration on Human Rights in Islam, those rights and freedoms can only be assessed in terms of what Islamic law permits them to mean, where Islamic law is the only criteria by which a determination can be made in the event of any dispute requiring resolution. And the standard is strict. Why? Because they said the standard was strict. When we say human rights, we mean Sharia law, and we mean nothing else. So, you take all